Brianna, are you still there?
Yes.
Can you please make Dr. Pedro Tanaka a panelist as well, please?
Sure thing.
He's also going to be one of the moderators. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that.
No worries. I'll go ahead and do it right now.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Mhm. Good morning, Dr. Tanaka.
Good morning.
Hi, Pedro.
Good morning, Dr. Arabs. Good morning, Natasha. I'll help Natasha with the question. I'll have my camera off in the OR. Then if in case you need it, Natasha, I'll be here. Okay. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Pedro. Well, it is exactly 6:30. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Natasha Taluska. For those of you who do not know me, I'm one of the chronic pain management faculty here. I did my residency and pain fellowship here at Stanford and have been on faculty since 2017. I have a strong interest in healthcare equity, and I'm very involved with the department's Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Health Equity. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to present to you our grand round speaker this morning, Dr. Cary. He is currently professor of surgery at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his undergraduate degree at Harvard University and did medical school at Howard University College of Medicine. He did general residency at Boston University Medical Center and did a colorectal fellowship at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He is the former program director for the general surgery residency program and is now assistant dean for the graduate medical education for the University of Pennsylvania Health System. He is truly passionate about medical education. He has a master's in medical education and has been involved in medical education in various capacity. It is truly an honor and pleasure to have him with us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Aarons. We truly appreciate your time. Some housekeeping items. If you need CME for this talk, there's a link in the chat, so you can click on that to claim your CME credit. And also have a Q&A at the end of the talk. Please type your question in the chat box and we're happy to answer them for you. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Aarons. Please take over.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I certainly would like to thank Dr. Tanaka and Dr. Taluska for the invitation and the really kind introduction. It's really an honor for me to speak today about, what I think is a very important topic, specifically diversifying the workforce by implementing more equitable strategies such as holistic review, which is something that we've had quite a bit of experience with. And I will review our experience today over the past 5 years or so in furtherance of this discussion. I don't have any disclosures. So today I wanted to start by first framing the importance of diversity, then discussing the context of representation and diversity and inclusion in surgical training. And while I'm focusing on surgery, which obviously is my specialty, I think there are certainly a lot of corollaries for other specialties, including anesthesia. Then I plan to sort of outline the framework of holistic review, because I don't know that everyone is always familiar with that practice, specifically in residency recruitment. And finally, we'll explore its implementation in graduate medical education programs, such as a residency training program like mine. So I think the one thing that's increasingly obvious is that residency recruitment is really really changing quite dramatically. I would imagine that September continues to feel like this for most program directors, and associate program directors certainly felt like this when I took over as program director, given the increasing volumes of applications to residency programs. And it does pose a pretty significant challenge in terms of the review process. The number of spots aren't changing, but the number of applications certainly are increasing. So for instance, last year in surgery, there was an average of almost 1,000 applications per program in the recruitment process, and that has steadily sort of increased every year. So in addition to increasing application volumes, there are a number of other challenges in the residency recruitment process, and I think that I view them as opportunities as well. Namely, the migration of step one and pre-clerkship grades in certain institutions to pass-fail, which can certainly sometimes make it hard to differentiate between students. There has certainly been an advent of more information, right? So the ERAS application now has a supplemental application to it. It has a lot of components like preference signaling, geographic preferences, and meaningful experiences. And I think while general surgery was part of the initial pilot, I think a lot more specialties are being incorporated, and I think anesthesia is one as well, incorporating a lot of these elements. So there's a lot more information that comes along with the application these days. Virtual platforms are certainly more pervasive in residency recruitment, and I think that certainly has its inherent challenges and benefits as well. And lastly, there is certainly a lack of diversity within some specialties, especially surgery, and I think that will be the focus a little bit more today of my talk. Really, how can we mitigate that consistent trend? So the question really then becomes, with all of this information, how do we continue to make meaningful decisions in residency recruitment that really promote equity and diversity in our training and learning environments? So just to take a step backwards, here's the scope of the problem as I see it. I think while there is an increasing emphasis on diversity in medicine to reflect the ever-expanding diverse patient populations with which we serve, there has been a disproportionate reflection of underrepresented minorities and women in medical and surgical specialties. And since we're going to be spending some time talking about underrepresentation and diversity, I really wanted to start with a common lexicon so we all understand where we have a common framework. So the WMC defines underrepresented in medicine as those racial and ethnic populations that are underrepresented in the medical profession relative to their general numbers in the population. And it should be noticed, while the focus tends to be on ethnic and gender underrepresentation, because there's a lot of data that we collect about gender and ethnicity, for the purposes of this discussion, I think we really should be thinking more broadly to include other underrepresented groups, based on sexual orientation, religion, physical disability, to name a few. Really, many attribute this problem to really what's called the leaky pipeline phenomenon, wherein there are fewer and fewer women and underrepresented individuals that progress through the ranks of academia from medical school, where there typically is better representation. Today, we'll be focusing on some principles that can affect that many levels of this pipeline. And within GME, I think we tend to sit back and sort of bemoan the fact that there aren't enough qualified quote unquote qualified women and underrepresented candidates in the pathway. Therefore, we can appreciate the downstream implications with respect to lack of diversity in leadership. And I really hope to convince you today that we can be really active participants in patching this pathway in our respective fields. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir today, but I think it's really important when you have these discussions to, again, emphasize the importance of diversity in healthcare. And in doing so, I think we really should be looking beyond making our programs more colorful for the sake of quotas or statistics, but instead seek to embrace diversity in all forms. And I'll talk about this a little bit later as it pertains to our program. But diversity in all forms, both compositional and cognitive diversity, as really a strategic imperative for every institution when it comes to promoting excellence. And in fact, there are plenty of studies that show that diverse teams are more creative, more innovative, and generally perform better at complex, high-level problems than non-diverse teams. And I think given these benefits, having a diverse representation in any institution, any program, could really be a powerful solution to the healthcare disparities that we see and other medical problems that face us in healthcare. So fortunately, this has certainly been a priority for many national organizations and should be for institutions as well, because we are at the point of care for these individuals. So with respect to surgery, I think the lack of diversity certainly has been a persistent trend. There are many studies that have shown that the proportion of Black and Brown trainees have consistently lagged behind other majority groups. And in recent updates of this data, it's really no different, if not a little bit worse, where we've seen that Black and Hispanic residents comprise probably about 4.5% of the US workforce. And Black and Hispanic faculty comprise probably 3 to 4% of the US workforce. And those numbers are really, especially for Black and African American residents and faculty, decreasing over time slightly. So holistic review has really been proposed as a really tangible strategy for mitigating this challenge in both the UME and GME spaces. So a lot of different schools, medical schools, GME programs have adopted holistic review in furtherance of improving diversity. This concept was introduced by the AAMC many years ago and is generally defined as an individualized way of assessing an applicant's capabilities by giving balanced consideration to their experiences, attributes, and metrics. And all of this really should be considered in combination with the value that you perceive that this individual may bring to healthcare and bring to your program. And to me, that's the really important part, right? I think there are many things about our student's application, a resident's application, that are indications of past performance, but we really want to start thinking about and evaluating candidates based on what we think their future potential could be. And while this approach seems very nebulous, and it certainly was for me when I started, it is important to know that it's really effective and really prevalent in a lot of programs. And I think was one of the main reasons why I was an advocate for bringing this into the GME residency space. So I think that's a great position statement. Every time I give this talk, most people then ask, really, what does that mean in practice? And just to delve into that a little bit more, in their framework, the AAMC recommends balanced consideration, as I said, for these domains. So experiences, attributes, and metrics. So looking at applicants' experiences, including their educational background, their research experience, community service, healthcare experience, leadership roles, really their overall distance traveled, as well as their attributes, not only gender and ethnicity, but their intellectual curiosity, language spoken, faith and values, to name a few. And then also weighing that with their academic performance. Now, I always sort of take a step back at this point because I think in residency recruitment, there certainly is a reliance on metrics. And I'm not saying that we should ignore those things, but I think there tends to be an over-reliance on these things, such as USMLE scores. So I think it's important to have a conversation in the context of which these things were created. And they really were basically a common evaluation system for medical licensure. They were not designed to be primary determinants of likelihood of success in a training program, yet they're often used in this capacity. So I think, relying on step scores, step 1 scores, and certainly now probably step 2 scores for a lot of programs really has some unintended consequences. Namely, there's obviously a lot of unnecessary stress and anxiety that happens in the pre-clerkship years as students prepare for this. But also, more importantly, it really discourages students from applying into our specialties because they think that they may be quote unquote too competitive. And I think it's also important to note that it really impacts the UIM pool that you will see, right? So admittedly, this is just one program, but it illustrates a really important trend, namely that the higher you set your cutoff, the more UIM candidates that you will exclude from your applicant pool, disproportionately so as compared with other groups. And certainly as a program director, I can certainly understand all of the tensions around filtering and the reasons why it's a very attractive approach. But I think it's important to put this in context. And thankfully, I think we've been forced to move away from a reliance on just step scores as an objective metric for performance. So holistic review has some really core principles which I think are worth going over. First, it stipulates that selection criteria really should be broad. It really should be mission driven and promote diversity in numerous aspects, okay? Selection criteria should also be applied equitably across the entire pool at all phases. I get a lot of questions sometimes about how you should treat different groups within an application pool, but I think you should have one set of criteria that's applied equitably across. You should consider, as we discussed before, consider an applicant's potential contribution to your program and to healthcare in general. And then that's really, all of this should be supported by objective performance data. So I wanted to pivot a little bit and talk about our story, which started in 2017, when we started appreciating a declining trend in the compositional diversity in our program. So our motivation for making the change to a more holistic approach was really grounded in increasing diverse representation. And my goal here is not to be prescriptive, because but rather to give a representation of how this may be used, and as well as the impact of diversity within one program. So before I begin, just some context. We are a large university-based general surgery program. We have 9 categorical positions per year. In total, we have 13 to 14 preliminary residents. And each year we receive probably more than 1,800 applications for just these 9 positions. We typically interview anywhere from 120 to 130 students per year for our program. So we started at the beginning. We started by inviting a visiting consultant to review our program's practices and policies surrounding diversity and recruitment. And this really was a fresh set of eyes to redefine our mission and values. And during this process, it was clear that our concept of leadership, which has been the cornerstone of our mission for many years since the inception of the program, creating leaders in surgery, had really migrated from merely focusing on the number of division chiefs and department chairs that our program had produced, and sort of pivoted to leadership in a lot of various fields and domains that impact academic surgery. So we're thinking more broadly about physician scientists, healthcare administration, public policy, healthcare disparities, to name a few, and leadership in that space. We then expanded our interview selection committee, incorporating 20 to 30 faculty or residents, depending on the year. Previously, it had been a very insular process where only a few people in leadership made most of the decisions. All our committee members participated in implicit bias training, again, just to have a common frame. And then we sort of put pen to paper and created our process. So in that process, we really de-emphasized the importance of scores and overall grades. In fact, I blinded the committee to USMLE scores, grades, even applicant photos, and ethnicity, and instead chose to emphasize experiences and attributes which we think resonate with our program, namely teamwork, leadership, altruism, intellectual curiosity, and research productivity. So this is a pretty high level view of our process, which I will admit quite freely has been very iterative over the last 5 to 6 years. As I said before, we receive roughly 1,800 applications annually for 19 positions. Okay. Last year, or the last year I was program director, we actually did not use a step 1 filter, but certainly in prior years we had, and I was very intentional about lowering it every year to assess our applicant pool such that we would not have a reliance on it in the future. So in the last cycle that I was program director, we did not use that as a filter. We then gave abridged applications to the selection committee electronically, namely the ERAS application, the CV, letters of references, and the personal statement. And from those materials, I think it was plenty sufficient for the committee who was tasked with looking at all these attributes to get that information. I think a lot of people think you have to read an application cover to cover to get a gist of what you're looking for, but certainly both for the process and for honing in on the characteristics that we felt were important, I think having a very abridged application review was instrumental. As I said before, the committee was blinded to grades, scores, photos, and ethnicity. Instead, we asked them to score applications based on academic achievement, intellectual curiosity, the quality of the research, capacity for leadership, teamwork and altruism, and really the strength of their letters. So in looking at our experience, if we compare the 5-year experience that we had with holistic review, 6 years now, with the 5 years prior to implementation, which I sort of termed the traditional approach, we certainly have seen a greater number of women and UIM students who have been ranked and matched into our program. We've also seen a greater number of medical schools that have been represented in our program, certainly a wider geography as well. All of this without seeing any real changes in the traditional metrics that we would look at. So no changes in step 1 scores, step 2 scores, and going even further, really no changes in the in-training exam results after they matriculate. And the composition of our program really has changed, certainly now with more equal gender representation. And as you can see here, a pretty steady increase in the ethnic UIM cohort of residents that we have, as well as the LGBTQ+ representation in our program as well, which has sort of steadily increased. I think it's really important to know from a practical standpoint, there will be, with the implementation of these practices, there will be some counter arguments. And I've heard them all, namely things like, I don't have time to read every application. I tell a lot of faculty that you really don't need to read every application cover to cover to have a gist and to be true to the spirit of holistic review. A lot of emphasis on scores, as I said before, and as a mechanism for predicting future performance, specifically on board exams. I've heard comments about whether or not we will be lowering the bar by implementing these kinds of practices, and potentially those applicants may not fit in or may not succeed in our program. And I think it's really important to impugn these narratives. And the data has shown over and over again that most schools and programs that use holistic review really didn't report any change in GPAs or standardized scores, graduation rates, or attempts to pass licensing exams. So as I start to finish up, I thought it'd be helpful to go over a few of the important elements and sort of lessons learned in my experience with implementing this process over the years. I think the first thing that I think is incredibly important is really starting at the beginning, right? I think most people want to jump to creating the rubric and doing the assessment, but I think it really starts with, again, defining that mission and that value at the outset. In this process, I think it's important to include a very diverse group of program leadership, so APDs, faculty, residents. And you really want to frame the discussion around the defined mission, whatever your mission is, what are your values? And importantly, the conversation should highlight that this is not just like a quality improvement project, but really an important cultural change in your program. There certainly will not be a one-size-fits-all approach to this. So I think starting at this ground foundational level with the mission and the values is incredibly important. Number two, I think it's important to balance the holistic principles that we discussed across the entire application process. I think sometimes the focus tends to be on the application, on the front end, the application screening and evaluation part, which is great. I think that's certainly important, but it also can be applied to interviews and certainly the ranking discussions, because we see a lot of programs that have a really broad applicant pool. They interview increasingly more UIM students and residents, but in those ranking discussions, they may not be as high on the list, or there may be some downward pressure on those applicants. So if you're gonna interview them and put them low on the list, then there really is not going to be any significant moving of the needle. Number three, I think it's important to design a process that is objective and data-driven, right? So when you create your rubrics, it should be based on the desired applicant characteristics that you think represent excellence in your program, and then measure those outcomes over time and track performance afterward. It certainly will be an iterative process. So at the end of each cycle, you may not see a lot of measurable differences, but I think it's important to be persistent. It really will be something that requires a lot of sustained effort. But you want to analyze the process. Think about, was there alignment between the mission and the values and the process and the tools that you had? Were there any obvious gaps that need to be filled in terms of personnel, training, in terms of budget? And was it an easy process to navigate? Because sometimes that can be a barrier. You want to analyze the outcomes with respect to the characteristics of interest. So, what does success look like for your program, and then continue to evaluate those outcomes. And think about, did the assessment tools really achieve the desired result? And then lastly, as I had to think about more critically when I was transitioning out of the program director role, is this going to be a sustainable process? And you have to really ensure that once one person or one key stakeholder steps away, that it will be a process that continues. So, who's going to be accountable? What resources are in place? And is there a system to monitor progress? And lastly, I think this is probably the most important thing you can take home from this is, as you go down this path, I think it's also really important to build a supportive mentorship network in parallel to your recruitment efforts. The lived experience of the residents that you bring into your program who are underrepresented in medicine will be entirely different in most cases from the larger cohort. So really formal and informal mentorship opportunities should really be implemented at the outset and really encourage engagement and targeted outreach with these groups. I think there really tends to be, when we have conversations about representation in programs, there tends to be a focus on the numbers, right? But as we strive to create more diverse teams for faculty and residents and other providers, it's also important to understand the current experience of those people that we recruit into the workplace, specifically those who are underrepresented in medicine. And I think it allows us to better create an infrastructure for support and mentorship in parallel to recruitment. I certainly have recognized that UIM residents that I've recruited often feel simultaneously a part of and apart from the teams and organizations that they serve. I certainly have the good fortune of mentoring a lot of wonderful, bright UIM residents, but every time I see them in the hospital, I'm, equally enthusiastic about seeing all that they're accomplishing and doing. But during our conversations, it's clear that there's also a sense of conflict in terms of identity formation. They feel simultaneously a part of and apart from something bigger. On one hand, they're motivated to be meaningful parts of the healthcare team and provide all the benefits of having a diverse workforce. We know that UIM physicians are more likely to treat uninsured and underinsured patients and serve in underserved communities. Patients are more likely to respond positively to the care offered by congruence between their physicians. And it's been shown to improve patient compliance and satisfaction and in participation even in clinical trials and research. Simultaneously, I think there are profound barriers that leave UIM residents feeling apart from their organizations and teams. There is a sense of social isolation and invisibility. There's certainly microaggressions and discrimination and bias that can be prevalent in learning environment, while others certainly report feeling different performance expectations, either being punished more harshly or expected to perform at lower levels than their counterparts. And I think all of this certainly comes at a cost, right? And one way to look at that would be in terms of attrition. So this is a recent study in JAMA Surgery, which was a cross-sectional database study looking at all surgical subspecialties over an 18-year period. And their main outcome of interest was resident attrition, either measured as withdrawals, dismissals, or transfer to another specialty. And they found that the overall attrition rate was about 7%, but it disproportionately affected some groups, right? So female residents were significantly at higher risk for attrition, and UIM residents were significantly at higher relative risk for attrition, almost 40% increase in the relative risk of attrition. This certainly was highest amongst Black and African-American residents with an attrition rate of 10.6%, excuse me. Similarly, there are groups that look at characteristics of well-being and have found that, certainly discrimination is based on gender is prevalent, based on UIM status is prevalent. And all of those residents who experience discrimination have higher rates of burnout, thoughts of attrition, and even suicidal. So coming back, I think it's really important, I can't emphasize this enough, really try to build a mentorship network in parallel with your recruitment efforts. So I wanted to finish by offering some strategies I think would ensure success over time. First, I think, as I keep saying, develop a mission statement, develop and really honing on the missions that openly acknowledge the benefits of diversity and inclusion in the culture of your program. And then really affirm that the learning environment is going to be different for the cohort within it, right? And you want to be supportive of that. I think it's also important to institute professional development programs that really will engage faculty to focus on mentoring learners from different backgrounds. We want to support our faculty as they participate in that process and give them the necessary tools via training or workshops that can allow them to be meaningfully effective mentors in that process. We want to really actively screen for inequities in any evaluation processes that we have. And then think about not just implicit bias, but also training with respect to conflict management and upstander training as well. I think we must really tackle some important concepts in mentorship. Namely, mentoring based on perceived compatibility will have possibly an effect of magnifying inequities. And certainly it's important to understand that UIM faculty adopt an unequal responsibility, this sort of minority tax, to promote efforts that promote diversity. Therefore, we have to really think about cross-cultural mentorship and provide opportunities to do so, because I think it really is a mutually enriching relationship that benefits both the participants and the larger organization. So again, creating cross-discipline mentorship for UIM residents at the outset. I have always found that it's really important to understand that, before they came to your program, these adult learners had, very robust lives and interests, which they may not have time for in surgical training, but you really want to consider engaging them in those organizations, those activities that they were meaningfully a part of before they came to your program. And incorporate assigned mentorship structure based on interest and career trajectory. And this really should be coupled with regular assessment of both recruitment, but also retention, clinical performance, and research productivity. And that will really ensure accountability in the process. So in summary, I think it's important to be intentional, and I hope I've stressed that enough today. You really should have an evidence-based process that aligns with your mission, that really encourages a challenge of the status quo. And I think it's incredibly important, as I've discovered in my time, to invest in faculty development. This is not something that one person can do. It really has to be a widespread effort by all the faculty in the program. So I get the one question I always get asked when I give these talks is, so that's great. It seems good in theory, but how does that really affect it? How has this change affected your program? So in my closing comments, I just want to highlight a couple of things that I've personally witnessed in our program over the last 5 years. And I think that's sort of been a reflection of the increased representation that we've seen. I think there's some foundational things, right? So implicit bias is required of all providers, and that's true in a lot of programs, as is the appointment of a vice chair of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think that again provides a foundation for education and accountability for this process. In our program, in our surgical program, we've established a Center for Surgical Health, which is almost entirely resident and student run, that supports the marginalized populations in Philadelphia. We've had these cultural complications discussions within our structured educational experience, where we talk about how racism affects team dynamics. We've had discussions about the artwork and photos on our walls, which is not new, but certainly new for our program at the time. And then we've seen a lot of resident-driven initiatives to reduce healthcare disparities in our affiliate hospitals. So not an exhaustive list, but certainly some of the high-level things that I thought were direct sort of implications of seeing greater representation in our program. So with that, I will close. I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahrens, for a wonderful talk. We know that there are so many benefits to having a diverse healthcare force. There's data to show that African-American and Hispanic physicians are more likely to work in underserved communities. And we know that one avenue to help reduce healthcare disparities is to training a diverse group of physicians. Thank you so much. This is a very important topic. We truly appreciate your time this morning. We do have some questions. If people have questions, please type them in the chat box. So the first question that we have for you today is that one commenter, focus on DEI is long overdue. The Senate versus House of Representatives methods of balanced representation present similar sets of pros and cons. What would be an ideal formula for medical schools and training programs? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is, what major unintended consequences are we willing to live with?
I didn't hear the first part of the question.
The first part is, what will be an ideal formula for medical schools and training programs?
In terms of DEI efforts?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we certainly have seen a lot of talk and mission statements and position statements, but very little sometimes meaningful action that stems from those discussions. So while I think that everyone needs to have those discussions in order to propel the conversation forward, I think we're now starting to see that there is an emphasis on developing meaningful strategies. And I'm certainly not a public policy guy. I'm not a high level DEI person in that domain, but I would say that, within your institutions and programs, start thinking about evidence-based, meaningful things that can propel those things forward. So for me, I think as in education leadership, this was certainly a very tangible thing that we could bring to a program that could see really meaningful changes over time and quite quickly. And I started this process by talking to people in the medical school, people in different programs, doing a lot of research in the GME space that's not necessarily within healthcare, to have a better understanding of what tangible strategies there are that exist that can be used. And I think that is true for a lot of different initiatives that are barriers to advancing these conversations.
Thank you. Another question is, one of the biggest barriers that we have in the Bay Area to recruitment is the high cost of living. What suggestion do you have to overcome this?
Yeah, I'm fortunate to live in Philadelphia, where we don't necessarily have that as a barrier. But I think, as you've probably seen in the in social media and the news recently, a lot of residents are fighting for these opportunities to have more equitable pay and forming unions and things like that. So I think that GME really has to be empathetic for this and really react to this accordingly. And I think certainly there are a lot of institutions that have housing stipends and have thought about more equitably where they're going to set their threshold for pay, right? I think, a surgical resident who works in Philadelphia shouldn't necessarily be making the same base pay as someone who works in California.
Thank you. In terms of underrepresentation, how do you see programs recruiting and increasing individuals with neurodiversity, chronic illnesses as part of medical training?
I think it comes down to what you said at the outset, right? I think, as I talked about before, I think the focus tends to be on the compositional diversity, but clearly that is just one measure of diversity, which is easy to track, which is why it's easy to focus on. But for your program, for your institution, developing the foundational mission and values that you hold dear, and then thinking about in recruitment how you're going to tease that out of the application. And I think it can be very static sometimes. You think that the information that we get is all that we have, but I would encourage people to sort of think outside the box. And I think there are a lot of ways that you can do that, right? So in addition to what's available by ERAS, there are some programs who are implementing things like simulation or situational judgment tests that can really get to some of those other questions that you may be looking for within your program.
Thank you. Another question. Anesthesia fellowship programs are experiencing a decrease in fellowship applications. Can you offer ways to continue doing a balanced evaluation in the setting, as opposed to a lot of applications to review, like anesthesia and surgery residency programs?
Well, in some ways, I think it becomes a lot easier, right? I think what the biggest barrier to this process is time, right? So, if there is a decreasing influx of applications, and I think one, you may want to think about why that is, right? Are you doing enough targeted outreach? Is your program or the specialty becoming an attractive opportunity for people who are underrepresented? But I think, sometimes slowing the process down is incredibly helpful, because if you don't have as much to go through, you can be much more thorough in thinking about applying all of these principles that I discussed today across that pool. The challenge with these larger programs and fellowships is that, it's seemingly overrun with too much information. So the ability to slow things down, I think, will certainly still reap the same benefits.
Thank you. When considering data showing improved outcomes with physician and patient linguistic and cultural concordance, and our country is growing rapidly with immigrants and non-English speaking patient population, what are your thoughts on using underrepresented language skills as a criteria for residency recruitment?
I think that is, it's certainly something that's being done. Like I've talked to program directors in different states and different geographical areas who value that as a part of their recruitment process. So they will look for those things within the application, because they think it's important within the specialty that they are responsible for to highlight that as a characteristic, because they know it's going to be important in the population that they serve. So it certainly is something that you can do, and is being done.
Thank you. We're glad you mentioned that broadening the definition of diversity. How do you operationalize this in recruitment processes, such as the holistic review process?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes down to that shift away from the traditional things, right? So, there tends to be, at least in surgery, an over-reliance on the objective things, your AOA status, your number of publications, your step 1, step 2 scores, et cetera. But I think as we've realized that those are important, but we also want to focus on other things, we really, in de-emphasizing those things as a part of the process, we're able to then focus on things that we think are also important measures of diversity. And operationalizing that really depends on where you start. So like, what is it that you are looking to find? And that's going to be different in every program. And I have found that sometimes there may be 1 or 2 attributes that you can't necessarily glean from the application as it exists. So you may want to create something either through simulation. A lot of surgery programs now are using situational judgment tests as a mechanism for thinking about things like professionalism or different ways of thinking that would be of benefit to their programs.
Thank you. This next question is very interesting, actually. There has been a push to increase patient presence in advisory boards and in more medical decisions. Would you see a benefit in including a diverse set of patients in the medical school application review or greater presence in medical training process?
That is a great question, and one that has not surfaced in all my discussions about this holistic review process, but I think it would be very meaningful, quite honestly. I think it, in a lot of programs, I think having that another perspective through another lens through which you can review an application would be incredibly useful. I need to think about that some more. But I think it would need to come with the appropriate amount of training and things like that. But you're right. I think advisory boards, even the RRCs, have patient advocates on their committees. So I think certainly that could extend to recruitment as well.
Thank you so much. We have another very interesting question as well. How do you respond to the faculty who says this approach is reverse discriminations and candidates should be screened based on their qualifications alone?
Yeah, I think it's again not a conversation about lowering the bar. We're not treating anyone differently. We're just creating a foundation and a framework from which we're all operating. And that framework, at least in our program, suggests that we're not just looking at scores, which we know standardized tests can be biased against certain groups, but sort of resetting the foundation to think about what are the experiences, what are the attributes in addition to those things that we think are meaningful. And that is applied equitably across all of the applicants. Right.
Thank you. The next question is, I think that the reliance on board scores has in part developed as a result of frustration with dean's letters and letters of recommendation that are infused with long narratives, such as the same descriptives for every student, outstanding, brilliant, best, etc. With board scores going away, what objective criteria do you use other than the number of publications, AOA status?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I've never read a bad letter of recommendation. I've never read a bad dean's letter. I think I've become increasingly better at discerning differences between letters, but they certainly are all very complementary, right? So I think that has been part of the impetus for this shift is thinking about, well, how can we build a process that allows us to differentiate? So I think one of the strategies that I employed was sort of grouping applications by school. I think that allows you to better differentiate between applicants. But I think you're right. I think we need to overhaul the entire system. And I think the WMC is in the initial stages of doing that, because this is a process that hasn't changed significantly since the late 90s. And we're now just seeing how things like more equity in the process, which is more student facing, right? So trying to develop more alignment between students and programs and better equity between students and programs in the process through things like signaling and geographic preferences and highlighting different parts of the application may be better than what we've been doing before, which is just focusing on the numbers. And if you look at the data on signaling and geographic preferences, which we've seen over the last 2 years of doing this, there definitely is greater equity for the applicants and for the programs in terms of aligning with what they're looking for. So I think this is a process that needs to shift away from the things that we've traditionally looked at for recruitment.
Yeah, I like the idea of grouping applicants per school. I think that's actually a great idea. Thank you so much for answering all these questions, Dr. Ahrens. It looks like we don't have any more questions. Thank you everyone for putting your question in the chat box. We appreciate that. And thank you for your participations. Are there any more questions? If so, please type them in the box.
Well, again, I just want to thank you for your time and your attention. It really was an honor to be a part of this. No,
this was an excellent talk. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate your time. And I think there are no more questions, and this is going to be the end of it.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Dr. Ahrens.
Yes, I think someone has a question.
Oh, no, I just said thank you, Dr. Ahrens. This is great.
Okay.
I'm sorry, you
Dr.
guys.
Tanaka, any question, anything? Well, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure having you.
Yeah,
You-
thank you.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahrens. Have a good day.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Dr. Kanaka.
Have a great week, everyone. Bye.